Now to continue on with shoulder girdle muscles, we have 5 muscles primarily involved in shoulder girdle movements. They have the trapezius, which we have in this particular book, talks about having upper fibers, middle fibers, and lower fibers. Some books have 4 different sections. We have traps 1, traps 2, traps 3, and traps 4. But in this case, we're just going to focus on these particular sections of this muscle. We also have the rhomboids, which are deep to the trapezius muscle. They're right underneath the middle fibers of the traps, the upper and middle parts of the traps. We have the levator scapula, which is actually attached to the underneath the upper part of the trapezius muscle. Then we have the serratus anterior, which is attached to the underside of the scapula. So if we look at it from this point, it's actually attached underneath there, so it causes rotation of the scapula, upward rotation of the scapula. Then we have the pectoralis minor, which is very deep. It's actually attached to the front part of the coracoid process of the scapula, and it's attached to the actual rib cage. So we're going to take a good look at all these, about exactly what they do. Okay, let's look at the location and action. Posterior and laterally, we have the serratus anterior, and it's attached to the rib cage and attaches to the underside of the scapula. It causes abduction, pulls shoulders away from the spine and rotates it upward. Next, we have the anterior side, which have the pectoralis minor. Once again, if we look at it, it's attached to the coracoid process and attaches to the rib cage, and it causes abduction, means shoulder blades rotate, protract, and downward rotation, when the shoulder blades are up here, causes downward rotation. It also causes depression of the shoulder blade as well too. Then we have underneath of that is subclavus, which causes nothing more than depression. Now, on the backside, posteriorly, we have the trapezius muscle. What we talked about, some books have it has in just upper, middle, and lower. Some books talk about traps 1, 2, 3, and 4. The upper fibers, which would be traps 1, which moves just the neck, but the upper fibers of traps 2, which can cause elevation and extension of the head as well too. The middle fibers cause somewhat of elevation, because remember, you have to look at the fiber angles. Are they pulling upward this way, which would cause upward rotation, or which would cause just elevation as well? They cause elevation, abduction, retraction, and upward rotation, as we saw before in that force couple. The lower fibers cause adduction, because if you look here, the outside fibers go straight down, but as we get more toward the upper parts of it, the fibers are going toward the midline of the body. So that's where they would cause adduction. The lower fibers are the ones almost vertical, cause depression, and when they're pulling on the scapula here, along with the fibers of the upper fibers of the traps and the serratus anterior, can cause upward rotation. Now the rhomboids are underneath, like I said, they're underneath the trapezius muscles, excuse me. We have the rhomboid minor and we have the rhomboid major. They cause adduction, retraction of the shoulder blades. They cause downward rotation. They also cause, when they contract, remember, here's the origin, here's the insertion. As the insertion pulls toward that, it can cause elevation and downward rotation of that, depending on how they're pulling. It can cause downward, if it's up here, when they pull, they'll pull toward the midline and rotate it downward, and cause, if the scapula is in its normal position, can cause elevation. So once again, you have to look at the fiber orientation to see what the angle is, what part of the entire muscle, what it's pulling on, to what action it's going to cause. And levator scapula, once again, it's deep deep under the trapezius muscle, it causes nothing more than elevation. Now let's look at the nerves. We talked before in learning module 2 about the plexus in the body, how the nerves are bundled together to go out to certain dermatomes and certain muscles in the body to cause the action. They're innervated by the cervical and brachial nerves and the cervical and brachial plexus. We talked about that. If you look here again, shoulder muscle growths primarily are innervated by the cervical and brachial plexus. Cervical and brachial. Brachial meaning the arm, cervical meaning the first 7, C1 through C8. The branches of C3 and C4, they work on the trapezius to activate that, the levator scapula, and the spinal accessory nerve, which also innervates the trapezius muscle. The dorsal scapular nerve, it works on the levator scapula for elevation, the rhomboid for retraction, downward rotation, and elevation, retraction. The long cervical nerve originating from C5, C6, and C7, that innervates with the serratus anterior. And the medial pectoral nerve originating from C8 and T1, that activates the pec minor. Let's take a deeper look now at all these muscles we just talked about and their innervations. First one is trapezius. Now we talked about before the upper fibers. Some books have it into 3 sections, some have it into 4. I know this particular book has working into upper, middle, and lower, but I also want you to take into consideration too that not everybody has the same interpretation and viewpoints that where muscles originate and start at, what their locations are and what they do. So we want you to take a good look at the upper fibers of the trapezius muscle. They do elevation, extension, and rotation of the head because it's pulling. But if you look here at this muscle and the way this figure is, we have this could be considered traps 1. The fibers are longitudinal and they're running straight up and down, so they would cause this motion. But as they extend down into what we would consider straight up and down or vertical, then we have angled fibers. They would do extension of the head, and then also too, if it's only pulling to one side, it could cause rotation as well too, depending if one side's only pulling. Then with these upper fibers here, which they consider the middle fibers, we have angled fibers here, which would be upper part of traps number 2, and the lower part of traps number 2 as well. This is more elevation. This is some elevation and retraction. So once again, they say the upper fibers only cause elevation of the scapula, extension and rotation of the head. The middle fibers, which traps number 2 could be, or the middle fibers, they cause, once again, depending on the fiber angle, cause elevation, upward rotation. We talked about that force coupled with the middle fibers, or the upper fibers of that. Traps number 4 and the serratus anterior could cause upward rotation, and it also causes adduction, pulling the scapula together. Because you can see the fibers as they pull that way, and also too, look how they converge from this way to this way. And if we actually do a vector analysis with one pulling this way, one pulling that way, if you actually added those together, they would actually cause, both added together would cause a vector to go straight in, which means they would cause retraction. Now the lower fibers cause depression of the scapula, adduction, help pull it together, especially the upper fibers of the lower part of the traps, or traps number 4, and they also cause upward rotation, which we talked about before. Levator scapula, it elevates the medial margin of the scapula, because you look at it, it's deep to the trapezius muscle and attaches to the shoulder blade and attaches to the upper part of the cervical spine, vertebral column, and only causes elevation. Now the rhomboid major and minors work together. Rhomboids minor, rhomboids major, They do adduction or retraction and draw the scapula toward the spinal column. They also help in downward rotation. If it's up here, it'll cause them, especially when they're lengthened, it's going to cause downward rotation, especially when they contract. They also cause elevation because there's slight upward movement accompanying adduction. So they'll do downward rotation and adduct. Serratus anterior touches to the rib cage and on the front side of the scapula. They cause protraction, draws the medial border away from the vertebra. It also causes upward rotation because the long lower fibers tend to draw the inferior angle farther away from the vertebra, thus rotating the scapula slightly upward. Pec minor does abduction or protraction. So look when they're pulling. Origin and insertion. Insertion always pulls toward the origin, so it's going to pull it that way, so it's going to pull it away from the spine. It tends to tilt the lateral border of the lower border away from the ribs. It does downward rotation. Remember, if you're up here, in upward rotation, it causes that, because if it's coming up here, when these contract, they're going to pull it down and downward rotation. It also causes depression. So when you're up here, if you got on the back side of the scapula, like trapezius number 4, the lower traps, can cause depression of the scapula, but so do the pectoralis minor. Now, from my experience also too, we do analysis on this particular muscle, because a lot of times it causes downward rotate, it causes depression and protraction, but if they're real tight too, it can cause elevation, especially when you're in a kyphotic nature. It pulls the shoulder blade up and forward. So you really have to, we actually have tests specifically for this, and we'll get to that in another class in this particular degree program. The subclavus, right underneath the clavicle. It's stabilization and protection of the sternoclavicular joint. It also causes depression. If you look there, origin, insertion, if the clavicle is rotated up, that means we've got elevation there. It'll cause depression to pull down on it. And it also will cause abduction, pulling shoulder blades away from the spinal column. Now, scapula abduction, scapula moves laterally away from the spinous processes without rotation. In other words, you're doing protraction. If you look at depending on what type of push-up you're doing and what type of bench press. If you're in the downward position of a push-up, and as you push away, you know, as you come up all the way, you can stop right there and still have the shoulder blades depressed and retracted. But if you move, you can also move away and protract them to get what they say, you get more action out of the pectoralis major muscle. The bench press too, if you got dumbbells, if you hold it here, then you're going to be protracted, because remember, as you protract, it's going to position that socket, especially when the arms are straight over your shoulder joint. The shoulder blade is going to be protracted, position the socket in the right place. As you come down this way, the shoulder blades are going to depress and retract together. Now, if you've got a bar in your hand, like in a regular flat bench with a bar, if you look at power lifters, they will bring the bar off, depress the shoulder blades, retract. That keeps that socket in the right position, so you have better range of motion, and also too puts the pec on a more of a stretch a little bit, so you're going to have more force production, because as it stretches, it stores elastic energy. Now, those are considered agonists as well too. The agonists here are the pectoralis minor and the serratus anterior, because it causes abduction. Abduction is a return from abduction, of course. Occurs with retractions, or pulling the shoulder blade together. The agonists here are the middle traps, the lower traps, because you got them pulling inward this way. If you got vector resolution, you got a vector here, an arrow pulling in, vector pulling there, and when you do the analysis, or addition of those two and resolution of that, you have fibers pulling toward the midline. So those are the middle traps, and the upper fibers of the lower traps will pull the scapula toward the spine as well. Also too, with the rhomboids, not only do elevation, they also do retraction as well. Upward rotation, lateral and upward movement. The agonists are the middle traps. Once again, they pull this way. The lower traps, they pull down. Then we have the serratus anterior. They pull this way, and this way, so it gets a force couple, so they rotate upward. Now, downward rotation, downward and medial movement. Glenoid fossa is rotated downward. As we said before, if it's rotated up, it pulls the glenoid fossa rotated downward when the downward movement of when the shoulder joint occurs, and pull-ups. And what happens is, when you're overhead, you've got the upward rotation. As soon as you start to do a pull-up or lat pulls, whether it's a pull-up or lat pull-down, the first thing that happens is you're going to downwardly rotate the scapula and you're going to depress it. So here's elevation, depression, and downward rotation. And the agonists here are pectoralis minor, pulls it down and depresses it. And also the rhomboids, because they're going to pull down and retract together. Now, lifting the scapula with that rotation in the anatomical position. How do you do that? Let's look at a shoulder shrug. Lifting scapula with that rotation. So we can have the shoulder blades, the agonist there, the levator scapula, the upper trapezius, and the middle trapezius too. Because if we do that, we're in the anatomical neutral position. It's not going to upwardly rotate because our arms aren't going above our head. All we're doing is one action. We're just shrugging our shoulders. And we're going to use the levator scapula because it does nothing but elevation. The upper traps, or traps 2 and 3, they're going to go upward. It's going to elevate, and the middle trapezius muscle are going to elevate those two. You're also going to get rhomboids, because depending on the angle of those rhomboids and those fibers, it's not only retracts, but it's going to pull, it's going to elevate as well too. Now the opposite of scapular depression would be, scapular elevation would be scapular depression. Example, let's look at a dip. Let's look at the agonist involved there, the lower traps. So when you get yourself up on the bars and you push yourself up, what's happening to the shoulder girdle? It's actually, as you push yourself up and extend the arms, the shoulder blades are going to come down. Because you can't be like this and try to do dips. You have to push the shoulder blades, to depress them to put them in the glenoid fossa in the right place, so the load can go right to the trapezius muscle, because the scapula should be stabilized in that position. So that's scapular depression, pulling it straight down. Also the pec minor, which is on the opposite side, what's it going to do too? It's going to facilitate doing depression in that position, so you can do the movement at the shoulder joint. Now the websites, one thing I wanted to say here, we've said this in the other learning modules as well too, but one of the things, it's really good to go through these, because a lot of times you can talk about, they have dissections, they have different tutorials about how these work. It also has links to how these particular systems or bones or muscles work in these systems, but also too, what happens when they get injured as well too. That's what I want you to really look at, because, and how do you detect certain injuries, how do you know they have them, and all that. Because once again, structure and function, you got to learn structure and how it all functions together, how the nervous system will fire the muscles and work to make a movement happen, but sometimes what happens when those things get injury. And also, it's another point of view that you can utilize too to facilitate the knowledge in this book as well. We'll see you next learning module.